happens when the people sworn to protect journalists become the ones arresting them? The images from Portland shocked America. A cameraman's lens, shattering police sirens blaring, and an independent reporter dragged into a van as masked figures cheered in the background. In that moment, the question cut deeper than the chaos itself. Was this law enforcement, or law erased? It began outside a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility on the edge of South Portland. Thousands had gathered under the banner of protest, but within hours, the demonstration turned into something else, a siege. Federal agents were pelted with fireworks and bottles, while the local police, once symbols of civic order, stood by. In the chaos, journalist Nick Sorter was filming Antifa's assault when a group surrounded him, cameras rolling, fists flying, and moments later, he was the one in handcuffs. According to Homeland Security briefings later obtained by Reuters, it wasn't an isolated incident. Over 100 attacks on federal property had gone unprosecuted, yet on the night Sorter was assaulted, only one arrest was made his. That footage, replayed across networks from BBC to Fox News, exposed a chilling reversal. Those documenting violence were treated as criminals, while the perpetrators vanished into the smoke. As the dust settled, federal analysts began connecting dots. Reports from DHS field officers suggested a pattern of selective enforcement, particularly in cities where far-left activists held influence. Portland was only the epicenter of a larger storm, an ideological battle testing the line between liberty and law. Defense News later compared the internal disarray to the confusion seen in hybrid warfare zones, where allegiances blur and truth itself becomes a casualty. Behind closed doors in Washington, the revelation shook the Department of Homeland Security. According to The Guardian's coverage, officials warned that political neutrality in enforcement is collapsing. Under President Trump's directive, DHS opened an immediate inquiry into what it called compromised policing. Early findings suggested that local officers may have received indirect incentives to de-escalate Antifa-linked violence, a claim that would soon unleash a firestorm. The implications extended beyond Oregon. Intelligence from NATO's internal counter-propaganda unit indicated foreign media were amplifying footage of Portland's unrest to depict America as fractured and divided. Russian state outlets framed it as proof of U.S. moral decline. Chinese networks cited it to deflect criticism over Hong Kong's suppression. The strategic cost was clear. Every burning street weakened the image of American stability abroad. But beneath the headlines and political blame, there were bruised journalists, battered police, and a city afraid of its own reflection. Citizens wondered whether accountability could exist in a system where ideology replaced justice. The scene of a bleeding reporter outside a federal building became more than a local scandal. It was a symbol of how fragile democracy looks when its guardians turn on their witnesses. As federal eyes turned toward Portland, one question began echoing through Washington's corridors and across America's living rooms. If even the press can't stand safely before the law, who will speak when the truth itself is arrested? It was supposed to be another night of protest, loud but predictable. Instead, it became the night America began questioning its police. What happens when the shield turns inward, protecting those it should restrain and silencing those who speak? The streets of Portland became the mirror of that question. Homeland Security investigators were quick to realize this wasn't about one arrest. Leaked memos reviewed by BBC and Reuters revealed that federal monitors had logged over 20 instances of Portland police standing down during violent demonstrations. Officers claimed they were de-escalating, yet videos from those same nights showed Antifa militants hurling explosives, setting barricades, and chasing journalists with no intervention. The case of reporter Katie Davis Court, struck in the face by a metal flagpole as police watched, added another layer of outrage. By early October 2025, President Trump publicly demanded accountability, calling the situation a betrayal of badge and oath. In Washington, Attorney General Pam Bondi convened an emergency task force to determine whether local law enforcement had been compromised. DHS analysts began using the same techniques applied to cartel and terror networks, tracking communications, tracing financial transfers, and mapping affiliations. What they uncovered pointed not to confusion but coordination. Documents later cited by The Guardian suggested that portions of Portland's police command structure had received unofficial guidance from city leadership to avoid confrontation with left-wing demonstrators even when federal assets were attacked. DW reported that such directives were justified under community trust building, but DHS saw it differently: obstruction. Federal agents described a pattern where city officers allowed Antifa groups to occupy streets near the IC facility, while focusing arrests on conservative counter-protesters or journalists labeled as agitators. The findings were stunning. According to internal DHS testimony obtained by Al Jazeera, several officers who made arrests that night admitted they were acting on orders they did not fully understand. That confusion or compliance blurred the line between policing and politics. Strategically, the damage rippled far beyond Oregon. In defense circles, experts compared the breakdown of local authority to asymmetric warfare tactics seen in Eastern Europe. Jane's Defense Weekly observed that internal ideological divisions were as corrosive to state stability as external infiltration. The comparison wasn't abstract. In Ukraine, similar fractures between military and civilian command had once allowed Russian propaganda to thrive. In the US, adversaries were already exploiting the footage to question America's unity. President Trump's national security advisors warned that America's internal disarray could embolden foreign adversaries from Moscow's cyber units to Beijing's influence campaigns. They want to prove democracy can't defend itself, said one DHS official in a briefing leaked to Reuters. If we lose legitimacy at home, we lose leverage abroad. On the streets of Portland, ordinary citizens felt that loss daily. Business owners boarded their windows, families stayed inside as demonstrations became ritual. The city's silence, no prosecutions, no accountability turned to bitterness. Police officers who once prided themselves on neutrality now faced suspicion from every side. Trust once the oxygen of democracy was running out. The deeper DHS dug, the clearer it became that Portland's crisis wasn't isolated. It was the symptom of a national contagion, cities divided by politics, policing reshaped by ideology, and justice blurred by fear of backlash. And at the heart of it all stood one haunting question that neither Portland nor Washington could yet answer when the guardians themselves lose direction: who guards the truth? Every political scandal begins with words, but the real story always lies in the numbers. What DHS found in Portland wasn't mere negligence. It was a financial artery feeding the very unrest the police claimed to suppress. The trail started at City Hall and ended in places no one expected: activist groups, former officers, and nonprofits hiding behind noble names. Federal auditors discovered that in 2024, Mayor Ted Wheeler's administration had redirected $15 million from the Portland Police Bureau into community safety grants. Publicly, these funds were intended to support mental health outreach and neighborhood peace initiatives. But as DHS investigators began tracing each transaction, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Money left City Hall under vague expense categories, passed through multiple nonprofits, and reappeared in the accounts of organizations already flagged for coordinating Antifa-linked activities. Reuters obtained part of the audit, revealing that several of these organizations had previously applied for federal relief grants under the same leadership names now connected to the riots. The result was a paper trail of plausible deniability. As one DHS official told BBC anonymously, it looked like social work on paper, but street warfare in practice. By mid-September 2025, investigators began treating Portland's finances as they would an international laundering scheme. Defense News reported that the DHS Financial Crimes Division used forensic accounting tools typically reserved for counterterrorism operations. What they found was a pipeline of ideological funding, money diverted from municipal programs into radical networks under the guise of civic renewal. Jane's Defense Weekly later compared the operation to a military intelligence campaign mapping influence rather than troop movements. According to their analysis, the Portland case resembled urban insurgency financing, where political legitimacy masks the logistics of subversion. Similar tactics were seen during protests in Hong Kong and Tehran, both examples where local officials were accused of tolerating activism that destabilized public order for strategic gain. In Washington, President Trump reportedly demanded a comprehensive report. The Guardian wrote that he viewed the case as a domestic equivalent of hybrid warfare in which political movements exploit bureaucratic loopholes to weaken federal authority. The discovery of city-level complicity transformed what had been seen as a local policing scandal into a matter of national security. The Department of Justice soon joined the investigation. A subpoena ordered Portland to release internal emails between police command and city finance officers. The results confirmed what federal analysts feared: some local officials had advised police to minimize confrontation with certain protest groups that benefited from those same grants. The implication was devastating: law enforcement neutrality had been traded for ideological alignment purchased with taxpayer money. As the case unfolded, parallels appeared abroad. Analysts from DW pointed out that the same playbook using civil funds to protect politically favored activists had been documented in Turkey's 2013 Gezi Park protests and Venezuela's Bolivarian mobilizations. In each case, state resources blurred with activism and public confidence crumbled. In Portland, the human toll was immediate. Officers who refused to comply found themselves reassigned. Journalists faced escalating hostility. Citizens who once believed in reform began to speak of resignation. The riots had not just burned property, they had burned trust. By early October, Homeland Security's final memo summarized the crisis in one chilling sentence: public funds became private weapons. That finding was more than financial evidence, it was moral indictment. And as Washington prepared its next move, another question emerged, one that no audit could answer. How does a democracy restore faith once its own institutions become the sponsors of chaos? The White House Situation Room was silent as the footage replayed flames, broken glass, riot gear glinting in the streetlights. Then came the still frame that changed everything: a police sergeant walking past masked rioters to handcuff a reporter. Enough, President Donald Trump said, according to sources cited by Reuters. If local leaders can't restore order, Washington will. Within 48 hours, the Department of Homeland Security launched Operation Clean Badge, a coordinated investigation targeting corruption within Portland's police and city hall. Attorney General Pam Bondi, flanked by DHS Secretary Chad Wolf, announced the mission with a line that echoed across every major network. Fighting crime means dismantling corruption brick by brick, even when it wears a badge. The operation deployed a joint task force of DHS financial analysts, FBI forensic teams, and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, working directly under Bondi's supervision. According to BBC reporting, President Trump had authorized the same emergency powers previously used to disrupt cartel financing in Mexico and to seize extremist assets abroad. This time, the battlefield wasn't Tijuana or Kabul, it was downtown Portland. Behind the scenes, U.S. intelligence began connecting the scandal to broader ideological networks. Defense News noted that DHS analysts were tracing parallel structures of funding and influence across cities like Seattle, Chicago, and Minneapolis hubs, where the same Antifa-linked nonprofits had received municipal grants. Al Jazeera reported that DHS treated these networks as domestic threat cells operating under the protection of sympathetic officials. As subpoenas flew, Washington's posture hardened. Bondi and Trump held a joint press briefing, warning that cities turning a blind eye to politically motivated violence would lose federal funding. "You can't fund anarchy with taxpayer money," Bondi said, "and if you try, we will find it." The following week, the Justice Department authorized the largest multi-state corruption probe in recent history. Internal DHS documents reviewed by The Guardian revealed investigators were using AI-driven data analytics to map how money, influence, and ideology intersected across jurisdictions. The results were staggering, overlapping donor lists, recurring wire transfers, and shared legal representation among groups implicated in riots from Portland to Philadelphia. Strategically, Washington's offensive marked a turning point. DW analysts described it as the domestication of counterinsurgency tactics, a hybrid between intelligence operations and civil law enforcement. Under Trump's direction, the administration framed the unrest not merely as a criminal issue, but as a national security threat aimed at undermining U.S. stability from within. This new framing carried weight internationally. European allies watching America's domestic turmoil began tightening their own measures against extremist financing. The United Kingdom's Home Office, according to BBC Europe, quietly shared intelligence on British-based donors linked to US protest movements. NATO's Counter-Hybrid Warfare Center in Helsinki described Washington's campaign as a template for democratic resilience. Meanwhile, on the ground in Portland, reality shifted. Federal agents in unmarked vehicles replaced local patrols. DHS task forces raided 2 nonprofit offices accused of funneling city grants into riot logistics. One staffer was detained under charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to incite violence. The spectacle reignited debates over civil liberties versus security, a dilemma as old as the Republic itself. For ordinary citizens, the sight of federal vehicles rolling through Portland's fog-shrouded streets was both relief and reckoning. To some it was justice, to others occupation. But even critics admitted one fact: the federal government was finally treating the unrest as more than disorder. It was treating it as infiltration. As Bondi told DW in an exclusive interview, "We're not just cleaning up a city, we're reclaiming the integrity of law itself." Still, a haunting uncertainty remained. If Washington could now override local authority in the name of security, where would that power stop? The money trail ended not in Portland City Hall, but in a labyrinth of corporate shells and shadow nonprofits scattered across the nation. What DHS discovered was not chaos, it was choreography. The code name given by investigators Riot Inc. The first hints emerged when DHS analysts noticed identical wire transfers linking activist groups in Portland, Seattle, and Chicago. According to documents reviewed by Reuters and The Guardian, these transfers originated from the same trust accounts registered in Delaware and funneled through foreign intermediaries. What began as a local corruption case had morphed into a national network, a protest economy engineered for endurance. Pam Bondi briefed President Trump on the findings inside the Oval Office. "This isn't street activism," she told him, echoing a line that later made global headlines. "This is organized logistics." Within hours, Trump authorized a multi-agency fusion task force, FBI, DEA, ATF, and U.S. Marshals under the Domestic Extremism Financial Directive, a wartime-level coordination order not used since the Patriot Act's inception. As Defense News reported, DHS agents mapped the network like a battlefield hub, supply routes, financiers. Riot Inc. functioned as a logistical backbone, a hybrid of NGO legality and militant coordination. Funding poured in through front organizations, promising social justice grants or equity initiatives, many receiving backing from major philanthropic giants such as the Arabella Network Tides Foundation and Open Society Fund. A later BBC analysis noted that even small foreign donations from China-based shell entities slipped through oversight gaps, creating what DHS called ideological laundering. Each connection deepened Washington's resolve. Trump's advisors framed the discovery as proof that America's domestic unrest had global sponsors. DW analysts compared it to proxy conflicts in Ukraine and Iran, external players fueling internal fractures to drain U.S. focus abroad. Intelligence briefings confirmed that Kremlin-affiliated media amplified Antifa narratives, while Beijing's digital influence arms weaponized footage of Portland's clashes to portray America as destabilized and divided. But beyond geopolitics, Riot Inc. exposed something darker about modern governance, the blurring of activism and enterprise. Jane's Defense Weekly wrote that Riot Inc. represented a privatized model of ideological warfare, one that used nonprofit status as armor. For investigators, it wasn't just who funded the chaos, it was how seamlessly they monetized it. Merchandising, legal defense, crowdfunding, live stream donations, every riot had a revenue stream. The human side of the story, however, remained haunting. In the aftermath of DHS raids, low-level volunteers, students, baristas, freelance medics found themselves swept into criminal investigations they barely understood. Many had believed they were helping humanitarian efforts. Al Jazeera documented testimonies from activists who said they were used as expendable bodies for causes funded in boardrooms. As public outrage grew, Riot Inc. became synonymous with betrayal. The Justice Department's preliminary report estimated over $100 million in ideologically motivated disbursements since 2020. Portland's name topped the ledger. International observers drew parallels with Europe's own struggles. In France and Germany, similar funding controversies plagued extremist groups on both left and right. NATO counterintelligence officials quietly praised Washington's decisive action, but warned that transparency, not repression, would determine whether democracy survived its own polarization. By late October 2025, President Trump stood before reporters and declared, "This country will no longer allow money to fund terror under the mask of justice." Yet even as he spoke, one question lingered over the flashing cameras: could dismantling Riot Inc. truly end the violence? Or had America already built a machine that thrives on division itself? When the Department of Justice finally released its report, the headlines hit like aftershocks: Portland's police under federal control. Riot Inc.'s assets frozen. Civil Rights Division finds political bias in law enforcement. But behind the triumphant sound bites a deeper tremor, spread a reckoning over what America had become when loyalty and law collided. The DOJ's 600-page document reviewed by Reuters and The Guardian outlined systemic failures that read more like espionage than administration. Portland police officers had, under directive ambiguity, deferred riot control decisions to civilian liaisons tied to activist organizations. Millions in public safety grants had circulated through shell foundations, some with offshore donors. Most alarming of all, internal emails showed that city officials were aware of these overlaps, but justified them as community partnerships. President Trump, flanked by Attorney General Pam Bondi and DHS Secretary Chad Wolf, addressed the nation that night from the White House. His words were measured, but the intent was unmistakable. The age of selective law enforcement is over. Every badge must answer to the Constitution, not to ideology. It was more than rhetoric. Within hours, federal oversight was imposed on Portland's police bureau, marking the first time in decades that a U.S. city's force was placed under direct DHS supervision. Abroad, the world was watching. BBC World noted that America's internal cleanup had paradoxically strengthened its image as a state willing to confront its own corruption, a rare act of transparency in an age of cynicism. Yet DW analysts warned of the opposite effect, that centralizing power in Washington risked blurring the same constitutional lines Trump vowed to protect. China's state broadcaster mocked the move as proof of dictatorship under democracy, while Russian outlets declared it civil war by bureaucracy. Inside the US, the fallout was personal. Portland's police union fractured. Several senior officers resigned, others were indicted. Protest groups splintered, some disbanding, others retreating underground. On the city's streets, quiet replaced chaos, but it was the silence of exhaustion, not peace. Local journalists who had once been targets of mob aggression now found themselves under federal protection, a bitter irony for those who had once demanded press freedom from the same institutions now guarding them. At DHS headquarters, analysts briefed Bondi on the broader implications. The probe had expanded to 5 other cities: Seattle, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Austin, and Chicago, where similar financial irregularities had surfaced. The phrase protest industrial complex entered official lexicon, describing a nationwide system that commodified dissent. Strategically, Washington had made its point. Corruption could no longer hide behind ideology. Yet the human cost remained unresolved. Small nonprofits that had once provided legitimate aid were shuttered under suspicion. Ordinary activists caught in the crossfire of investigation felt betrayed by movements they thought righteous. Internationally, NATO's Security Council cited the case as a model of hybrid threat response, a domestic mirror of the same vigilance used against cyber attacks and information warfare. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly warned that the US example might inspire allies to tighten protest laws, testing the boundary between freedom and order across Western democracies. And in the middle of it all stood a question older than the Republic itself: can a nation defend its liberty without wounding it? As dawn rose over Portland's skyline, the city looked outwardly calm. The federal agents had packed up, the protests had faded, and the ICE facility's walls were scrubbed clean of graffiti. Yet the scar remained, not in concrete, but in conviction. America had faced its own reflection and found the image fractured. The final line of the DOJ report read like an epitaph for the age of outrage. When enforcement bends to ideology, democracy becomes performance. The investigation was over, but the debate was only beginning about loyalty, power, and whether justice could ever again stand above politics. Because if the guardians of law can be swayed by cause or coin, who guards the guardians now? In 2025, the Department of Homeland Security exposed deep corruption within Portland's police force, revealing ties between officers, city officials, and Antifa-linked networks during the ICE facility riots. What began with journalist Nick Sorter's violent arrest unraveled into a national scandal, showing millions in public funds redirected to activist groups through community safety grants. Under President Trump, Attorney General Pam Bondi and DHS launched Operation Clean Badge, deploying federal agencies to trace the money trail that led to Riot Inc, a shadow network connecting donors, nonprofits, and street operations across major U.S. cities. The findings triggered federal oversight of Portland police, widespread resignations, and criminal prosecutions. Abroad, allies saw a test of American accountability, while rivals framed it as political authoritarianism. The investigation revealed how ideology and finance had merged into a weaponized form of civic activism, forcing the nation to confront a painful paradox: in defending freedom, it had to